Okay, I'm not entirely sure how I'm supposed to follow up on all of those presentations, but I'm going to do what all academics do, and that is revert to statistics. So you'll have to stick with me for a little while. What I'm going to do really is put a framework on a lot of the things that we've actually already heard, and to go through some of the social science evidence that we have that actually pretty much back up everything that we've heard already here today. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit. There you go. Caught in motion. No? I broke it already. The pictures and stuff behind me. Maybe start it again. Yeah. That's it. Oh.
She's 2 minutes in, you know.
I'm up and running.
You're good to go.
Yeah.
Okay, I was going to start asking for questions.
Perfect. So we'll start off by talking a little bit about our representative democracy and the views on our representative democracy, just to get an overall impression of what the citizens' actual views are. And we have information from a whole load of social science surveys, some of them going back 30, 40 years, some of them more recent, that can give us both a longitudinal and a comparative analysis of what people actually think about our representative democracy, but also then to be able to locate the individual the countries within a broader comparative framework. So if we start off by talking a little bit about individual citizens' engagement with politics, we get actually a pretty good impression to begin with, and we see that over the last number of decades in Ireland, actual interest in politics has been on the up. So we start off with a fairly positive picture of the system. The number of people who are very interested is going up, albeit from a low base, but those who report being very interested is quite high. This is information from the Irish National Election Study in 2011. You see the number of people who are not at all interested is actually quite low, and the vast majority of citizens actually fall into that middle category there and declare themselves to be quite interested in politics. So there's a lot to work with here. You're not talking about people who are completely remote or distant from the system. People are reasonably connected with the system. We also see that political action has been on the increase. Now the picture is a little bit more mixed here, because we need to think about what do people actually do within the political system. And one of the most important ways in which people interact with the system is through political parties. And the reality is that membership of political parties has been in decline in Ireland and internationally for the last number of decades. But that's balanced by a change in the way in which people participate through or with the political system. So we now see other modes of political participation are actually on the increase. So people are much more likely to sign petitions, to join boycotts, to attend demonstrations. So they are participating in the political system, but in a somewhat different way to what they would have done in the past. And one of the questions, though, that comes out from this change in participation is that some of this participation is much more surface level. It's more transitory, it's passing, it changes from issue to issue, and that means that citizens aren't thinking about politics in maybe quite the extensive way that they would have done if they had been members of a political party, which is more of a longer-term commitment and involves probably more thinking about politics. So the citizens are still interested, they're still participating, but they're doing so in a different way to what they would have done 35 or 40 years ago. If we ask the citizens what are their views on democracy, what we find is that by and large, most people fall into the middle categories. And this is a social science point. You should never give a middle category because people will generally opt for it. And this is the table that tells us this. 0.5 is the middle. And again, it's a glass half full, glass half empty picture. You can say that people should be maybe more or less satisfied, but at least they're still in the middle. They're there for the taking. They are open to persuasion, and there's quite a number of people who are clustered here. So we have an 11-point scale from extremely satisfied to extremely dissatisfied. The number who are extremely satisfied are pretty small, but it has to be said that those that are extremely dissatisfied are also relatively small as well. If we move from kind of thinking about kind of engagement and general views about our democracy, we want to look at kind of the more specific aspects of our representative democracy. And there are two kind of components that we're interested in. One is the people in our system, and the other are the institutions. So we're going to start off talking about the people, and these are our politicians. And the reality is that the public perceptions of politicians have generally tended to be pretty negative. Now, I was looking for pretty dodgy pictures on the internet during the week. Sorry, I'll get some of them up. And when you type in politician, these are some of the images that actually appear. Now, I eventually opted for this one. Now, the toad does not come up, it has to be said, under images of politicians. But what this does tell you is that generally people's views of politicians are actually quite negative. And they have seen their kind of trust in politicians has actually declined, but from an already very low base. So politicians were never popular, and they have become even more unpopular. They're quite fortunate that they have bankers down the bottom of the system to take some of the heat, because there is so much dislike for them. This is not a new phenomenon, though, for any of you reading the kind of letters pages of the Irish Times, because I've also been living abroad, so I now read the newspaper more extensively every day, and they were quoting Jonathan Swift and his disdainful comments on politicians. Now, you don't have to go back to the 1700s, but you get the general impression that politicians were never really very important, and they're becoming more and more unimportant, more and more unpopular. Now, what all of these slides are going to tell you is that, again, this is a set of data from the European Social Survey, starting in 2002, and this is distrust in politicians. So the upward curve means more and more people are actually distrusting politicians. And what we find is, again, I have an 11-point scale here, that the majority of citizens, actually more than 50% of people, are clustered in the distrust system. So the vast majority of people really don't trust the people who operate within the system. But the thing is, when we go and look at the Irish National Election Study data, there is a more mixed picture. When you ask people about their own local politicians, you actually get a different impression. Most of them think that their own local politicians are fairly hard-working fellas for the most part, and that they generally do the best they can. So there is, if you want, a dichotomy or kind of a difference people have between the group of politicians that they associate with kind of running the government in Dublin and the local fella who really isn't that bad at all and is usually there to answer the phone when you need something done. So we also see this actually translating a lot of the time when we ask people questions about political reform. And I listen a lot to the radio as well, and listen to the radio talk shows, and we should get rid of the politicians. We should reduce the Dáil to 100, and we ask people these questions in surveys all the time. Do you think the Dáil should be reduced to 100? Absolutely. How many TDs from your area? Oh, well, we're grand in our area, actually, as it so happens, right? It's the lads in Dublin. I'm not from Dublin, okay, so I apologise, I'm from the country. It's invariably someone somewhere else that they want to reduce. And you have to keep this in mind when we're having these discussions about political reform. We have to go back to what do the citizens actually want, because a lot of the political reform debate sometimes is kind of tied up in a bubble, and it doesn't take account of the actual views of the vast majority of the citizens and the preferences that they express through the elections, however flawed those might actually be. So, to sum up with the politicians, It's a difficult situation. They were never terribly popular. They've become even more unpopular. They're in an absolutely invidious position because they're reliant on being popular to do the actual job they have to do. So they have to make themselves more popular with the electorate. So we need to think about that. You've all these awfully unpopular people who need to be popular, who need to get themselves elected. And it gives us bad outcomes. But when you set it up like that, how else is it going to end? What's probably more important, I think, though, in terms of the more recent past is what's been happening with regard to citizens' confidence and trust in our political institutions. And this is where we see that there has been a very, very significant change. If we go back to 2002 and we ask people to imagine what the Dáil looks like, you'll get them describing something like this, because there was generally actually fairly high levels of trust in our Parliament and our political institutions. If you go ask them to describe what Parliament looks like today, you're going to get something a little bit more like this. And what the evidence we're going to go through here shows is this just reinforces the point the pictures are making. And these are from the European Values Survey, starting in 1981, so we have actually data going back over 30 or 40 years. And this is, in social science terms, a beautiful graph. This is exactly what you want it to do. You have a sharp downward curve here. But the reality of what this translates as is that people are becoming more and more distrustful of their political institutions. So I'm reporting, just for brevity here, just the people who have a great deal of confidence in Parliament. And you'll see that that has actually halved in the space of 30 to 40 years. And this same pattern is repeated no matter how you change the data and when you move from one set of surveys to the next set of surveys. So the first round were the European Values Survey. This is a shorter survey, the European Social Survey. It started in 2002. And here we're asking people, do you trust your levels of trust in Parliament, and I'm reporting no trust at all on a scale of kind of 1 to 4 here, and you see people are becoming more and more distrustful of their political institutions. This is the same information, the same picture from the Irish National Election Study, and this is taken from 2011, so we're kind of bringing it forward to today. Here we have political parties, again, the fundamental units by which our political institutions, the basis of how our political system works. I'm not sure who those small handful of people who answered the survey who said they had a great deal of trust in political parties are, but they are obviously the optimists that are left. But you'll see here the vast majority of people have very little trust in political parties. This is a kind of a table which effectively tells you exactly the same thing, that the numbers of people who deeply distrust political parties, it's far in excess of half the electorate. And when you think about a political system which is organised around political parties, this is the fundamental unit, the basis of how our political system operates. If the vast majority of citizens have no trust in those institutions, then you have a serious problem within your political system. And again, this is telling us the same thing. The number of people who have a lot of trust in the political parties tend to be quite low, and a lot of those people are, well, hopefully some of those people are actually the members of the political party. We're in big trouble if even the members don't support and don't trust the political parties that they're members of. So the same thing again in this particular table. And why does it matter about the political institutions? And I suppose, why do I distinguish between the politicians, between the people and the institutions? People come and go, our politicians change, and people have a great sense that they can move the politicians in and out. But the institutions are permanent. And the problem is when people lose trust in the institutions in a very significant way over a period of time, then the entire system, the legitimacy of the system comes into question. If people don't trust the institutions, they're less willing to accept the outputs or the outcomes from the institution. So they're not going to accept as rightful the outputs that are coming out of the political system. And that's why the kind of collapse in trust in institutions is more significant, if you want, than people's negative views of the individual politicians. It's not just politics, though. I mean, we often talk about a crisis of institutions. This is what the table looks like for the Catholic Church. No great surprise here. They're not very popular. They're not very popular either. How much confidence in the European Union? We've also seen a collapse in confidence in the European institutions. It's also true, and I should add in that, in particular, the countries that have been more severely impacted by the global financial crisis have seen their trust in institutions eroded much more than those who are less impacted. So in particular, if you use the European Social Survey, if you take a kind of a graph of Europe, what you find is that southern European countries and Ireland have seen much more significant declines in trust and confidence in their political institutions, because people feel much more let down by the political systems that they have been dealing with. So, having said all of that, kind of going to finish up by saying, well, where do the citizens get these opinions from? How come we've seen such a change in citizens' opinion over such a short period of time? Well, I'll go back to where I started with regard to engagement. Patterns of engagement are changing. They're still positive. There's still a lot of engagement with the political system, but it's much more transitory. It's not as intense. People think less about politics. There isn't the same amount of deliberation and thought about the way the system works, and that means that they're susceptible to other ideas. There's also a question about expectations, and this has been discussed a lot actually in the UK, and it's coming back to a point raised by Rory, where he said, there was a minister on the TV and he said, well, we break promises all the time. That's what politics is about. And the reality is that is what politics has become about. Because if we go back to the original point about politicians saying, well, they are unpopular, they're trying to be popular, so what do? They promise you stuff. They promise you ever more stuff every single time. And there's an expectations gap that has emerged at the core of politics, not just in Ireland, internationally, because political systems just aren't able to deliver on the promises that are made at elections. They're not able to deliver for all kinds of reasons. Even if you take austerity out of it, think about the structure of the state and where the state now sits in the global environment. You're talking about countries that are affected by globalisation. They're trying to respond to the demands and needs of international business. They feel pressured to comply with all of these embedded global social and political norms. There's all kinds of agencies out there checking how good they are at this kind of right and that kind of right. So there's an awful lot of external pressure coming down on the state in a way that simply wasn't there 30 or 40 years ago. We also think about the demands that are coming up from the citizens about what their expectations with regard to politics are. And very often, as a consequence, we now talk about what's called an intermediary state. The state isn't sovereign. The state isn't autonomous. The state is a kind of intermediary. It's a middleman between the external international environment and the domestic pressures coming from the local electorate. And caught up in that, there is an expectations gap and an expectations problem, where the state simply can't just deliver on the kinds of promises that are being made. The media also have a role to play. I'll just play a little clip for you if you need to be reminded to the sound of this. Hopefully it will work.
Welcome to RTE Radio 1.
Hello, good afternoon, and you're very welcome to Live Line.
Where Joe is likely to say,
according to the Gardaí, you are all grossly exaggerating.
Before I get shut down, the point we're trying to make here, and it's one again that's international, is that the way in which politics is projected now is much more around the voter as a consumer. And the media facilitates a process where the voter as consumer is entitled to be outraged. Every time they don't get exactly what they want, they're entitled to communicate that and their expectations failure, the fact that there hasn't been, if you want, a delivery of their promises. This comes from lots of different places. One, there was the expectations gap in the first place, but two, there hasn't been the education structure behind our representative democracy, which explains it and posits it as one that is about collective choices, not individual choices. So we get the individual response of individual individual citizens who are disappointed when their individual needs have not been met. But politics is not really collectively, if you want, portrayed or put out as a decision-making for the community as a whole or the collective. So citizens are disappointed when politics doesn't live up to where they want it to be. The other thing to say about the media, of course, is that the media has changed as well. We now have much more emphasis, if you want, on media as entertainment, news as entertainment. You've had privatisation of the media, and with all of that comes the additional, pressures to change the way in which the system is portrayed and is communicated. Kind of coming on to the last thing, what I would say is that we have been, as academics and commentarians, talking about the failure of politics since the 1960s. So don't be alarmed, we are rarely correct. These lads are the two most eminent scholars, and they've been talking about what's called the failure of politics. We first started talking about the crisis of representative democracy in the 1960s. They were concerned about the protests in the US about the Vietnam War. Then it was Watergate. Through the 80s, things kind of sat down a bit. And then in the 1990s, we were absolutely delighted because we decided that democracy had triumphed. Because there was the collapse of communism and this new third wave democratization, and you had a whole load of new countries becoming democracies. By the time we get to the end of the 1990s, we realise that the picture is not entirely rosy, and the system, if you want, is in crisis and is being concerned once more. And that's when we get to people like Matthew Flinders talking about this expectations problem, and that it's the expectations both from the politicians and what they can deliver, and from the voters with regard to what really is possible within the system. So it's not a case that you can blame the voters or you can blame the politicians. It's about the entire system. So I leave you with two particular questions. That is, that how should the system respond to this position? And then, I suppose, a kind of a slightly less optimistic one, which is whether we think the system can actually respond to the reality of these challenges.
Thanks, Teresa.